You guys ready? Okay. Hey, good morning and welcome to today's Lantos Human Rights Commission hearing on human rights in India. I extend special welcome to our witnesses and I want to thank them for taking the time to share their expertise with us this morning. India is an incredibly important country. It ranks 7th in land size and overtook China last year as the world's most populous country. It is incredibly diverse ethnically, culturally, and religiously, and it is considered the world's largest democracy. Democrats and Republicans alike recognize India's importance and have worked to deepen U.S.-Indian ties based on our shared interests, including China. The Biden administration's launch last year of the ambitious U.S.-India initiative on critical and emerging technologies is a recent example. But as bilateral ties have deepened, concerns about human rights abuses in India have grown. The U.S. government's own human rights reporting reflects these growing concerns. The State Department's most recent human rights report, covering 2022, identified significant problems, including restrictions on religious and press freedoms, violence targeted at national, racial, ethnic, and religious minorities, harassment of and restrictions on civil society and human rights organizations, corruption, and lack of accountability. The 2023 Trafficking in Persons report found that overall anti-trafficking efforts, especially against bonded labor, are still insufficient. As we will hear today, the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom has recommended for some time that the State Department designate India as a country of particular concern. Many of the problems that most worry human rights observers have been linked to current Prime Minister Modi's push to reshape India's secular democracy into a Hindu First Nation. This coming April 19th, India will begin multi-phase general elections that will determine the country's political direction for the next 5 years. Prime Minister Modi is seeking a third term. I'm one of those people who thinks that friends should tell each other hard truths. And India is a friend, and it is truly important to the U.S. that India prosper. Yet there is a real risk that the tensions inherent in diverse societies could harden into dangerous conflicts and undermine India's bright future if human rights abuses are not addressed. The recent communal violence between ethnic Hindu and Christian communities in Manipur state is just but one example. Congress must do its part to urge the Indian government to correct course and reconsider policies and laws, including counterterrorism laws that are inconsistent with the obligations India has acquired through its ratification of key human rights treaties. That's why we're here today. We have an excellent panel of witnesses who will update us on their human rights situation, in India based on their most recent reporting, and will offer recommendations for steps that Congress could take to incentivize India's compliance with its obligations. Speaking out, as we are doing today, is important. In that regard, I urge my colleagues to co-sponsor HRES 542, which condemns violations of international religious freedom in India. But clearly more is needed, and I look forward to the witnesses' ideas. This hearing has attracted significant interest, and we are expecting statements for the record from several organizations, including the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. And without objection, I move to submit for the record the statements we receive. This is a large hearing, and unfortunately, we may not be able to accommodate everybody, but you can watch it on TV. So I appreciate it if everybody could limit their remarks to 5 minutes, and with that, I'm happy to yield to Co-Chair Smith for any opening remarks he may have.
Thank you very much, and good morning and welcome, Commissioner. Thank you and all of our distinguished witnesses to this important hearing. Religious freedom has often been referred to, and rightfully so, as the first freedom, foundational for all other human rights in our world. As author of the Frank R. Wolf International Religious Freedom Act, which became law in 2016, I work on religious freedom rights around the world just about every day, and you do it so extraordinarily well over the Commission, Stephen, so thank you for that leadership. It's extraordinary. As we know from the latest International Religious Freedom Report, 13 of the 28 states have restricting religious conversions. Numerous reports during the year of violence by law enforcement authorities against members of religious minorities in multiple states. In multiple states as well, police arrested Christians accused of forcing others to convert. Christian groups said police sometimes aided crowds who disrupted worship services the crowd said were forcibly converting Hindus. Attacks on members of religious minority communities, including killings, assaults, and intimidation occurred in various states throughout the year. There were also attacks on pastors, disruption of Christian and Muslim worship services, and vandalism of churches. And let's not forget that the one person who got denied a visa pursuant to the International Religious Freedom Act, the original bill written by Frank Wolf, was Modi, because of his killing and his ordering, and I think the evidence is very clear, of a large number of Muslims in India. It is clear from the report that Muslims suffer greatly, and that for both Muslims and Christians, the situation can vary enormously from state to state within India. So this will be, I know our witnesses will be focusing on this and other issues of human rights abuse. I also appreciate the benefit of your expertise in contextualizing the IRFA report and the reports of your own organizations. At 1.5 billion people, more people live in India than the entire continent of Africa. They speak to dozens of different languages. How do we break down the situation on such a large and varied country so as to better understand and advocate for human rights there? A second very, very key issue with regards to human rights is human trafficking. While the TIP report puts India as a Tier 2 country, I think they should be downgraded, quite frankly. Here, and I am the author of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000 and 4 other laws, and I, like many of my colleagues, follow it very, very closely. India has a very serious problem with human trafficking, and as the most recent report pointed out, the TIP report, prosecutions are down. And when you don't prosecute the traffickers, that enables and helps those who commit such cruelty to do even more of it, and they are doing that in India today, both labor as well as sex trafficking. Third, international parental child abduction. Again, I've authored the law there as well. It's called the Sean and David Goldman International Child Abduction Prevention and Return Act of 2014. India has not adhered to any of the protocols with respect to international parental child abduction. That's including the Hague Convention. And the U.S. government has tried repeatedly to engage. I talked to Modi myself on behalf of a constituent, a woman who lives in New Jersey, whose children were abducted back to India, and she has been treated so harshly, not only by the abducting parent, but also by the government, fearing for her own life. I had a couple of hearings, several hearings on this issue, but she was one of our star witnesses at one of them. Her heart is absolutely broken, and she can't even, her kids are coming close to the age of 18. Parental alienation has really taken a deep toll. The abducting husband has so abused her memory that the kids don't even want to see her anymore. I mean, it is the classic case, and the government has done nothing. They are on the list as well, a sanctionable list. They could be sanctioned just like if they get a CPC designation on that laws as well. And I would hope that the administration would sanction them. As my friend and colleague Jim McGovern just said a moment ago, we consider India a friend, but friends don't let friends commit human rights abuses. And in those 3 areas and more, human rights abuses are being committed with impunity by state governments as well as by the national government. Yield back.
Thank you very much. I want to thank the co-chair for his excellent statement. And we want to introduce the first panel, which consists of Stephen Schneck, who is a commissioner on the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, USCIRF. He also serves on the governing boards of Catholic Climate Covenant, which advocates for environmental justice and care for creation, and of Catholic Mobilizing Network, a Catholic organization working to end the death penalty and advance restorative justice. Mr. Schneck, we're happy to have you here, and the floor is yours.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Co-Chair McGovern. Thank you, Co-Chair Smith, and any other distinguished members of the Commission for this invitation. It's an honor to represent the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, or USCIRF, to testify this morning at this important hearing on human rights in India. As I believe everyone knows, USCIRF is an independent, bipartisan U.S. federal government body that is dedicated to promoting the universal right to freedom of religion or belief around the world for people of all faiths and for people who choose to have no faith. Human rights conditions in India are incredibly concerning. I will focus my testimony on specific ways the Indian government targets individuals' rights to freedom of religion or belief. The government, led by the Bharatiya Janata, or BJP party, enforces discriminatory Hindu nationalist policies, perpetuates hateful rhetoric against religious communities, and in several instances has failed to address communal violence that disproportionately affects Muslims, Christians, Sikhs, Dalits, Jews, Adivasis, and the Adivasis who are indigenous peoples of India. Last week, Indian officials announced the implementation of the Citizenship Amendment Act, or CAA, which provides a fast track to citizenship for Hindus and other minorities seeking asylum from neighboring Muslim-majority countries, such as Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Bangladesh. Notably, this law, however, omits Muslim refugees, including Rohingya from neighboring Burma, Ahmadiyya Muslims from Pakistan, or Hazara Shia from Afghanistan. The law's initial passage in 2020 sparked large-scale protests across the country that provoked a harsh and deadly crackdown by police forces, including the arbitrary arrests of activists and students like Umar Khalid, Sharjeel Imam, Miran Haider, all of whom today are still detained under the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act. Indian authorities also continue to detain religious minorities under various state-level anti-conversion laws, which are in effect, as we just heard, in 12 of the 28 Indian states. These laws enable and encourage Hindu nationalists to target and discriminate against religious minorities under the guise of protecting the Hindu faith and upholding state laws. The application and advocacy of these policies by government officials has created a culture of impunity for nationwide campaigns of harassment and violence, particularly against Muslims and Christians. Anti-conversion laws are increasingly targeting interfaith marriages or interfaith couples, restraining an individual's right to convert and curtailing the right to choose one's partner. These laws carry penalties of hefty fines and imprisonment. In addition, 18 of 28 states have cow slaughter laws, which have been used as justification by vigilantes for violence targeting religious minorities for consuming or transporting cattle. Similarly, the Indian government's lack of response and investigation into ongoing violence in Manipur state fits into a larger pattern of behavior that neglects communal tensions between religious groups in favor of the Hindu majority. Since June, violent clashes between ethnic Hindu Maitai and Christian Kuki communities resulted in the destruction of more than 500 churches, 2 synagogues, and the displacement of over 70,000 people. In addition, in Haryana's predominantly Muslim New district, communal violence erupted following a Hindu procession in July, where participants carrying swords chanted anti-Muslim slogans. There, a Muslim tomb and mosque were torched, resulting in the death of at least 7 individuals, including Imam Muhammad Hafiz. In the lead-up to national elections, such violence and hate speech against Muslims escalated to an alarming level. USCIRF remains equally concerned about the Indian government's efforts to export these harmful practices beyond its border. In 2023, Indian authorities increasingly engaged in acts of transnational repression to target and to silence religious minorities abroad, including human rights advocates and journalists reporting on religious freedom issues. In September, Indian authorities allegedly killed Sikh activist Hardeep Singh Nijjar in Canada, which was followed by an alleged plot to kill Gurpatwant Singh Panun in the United States in November. The Indian Religious Freedom Act of 1998, the International Religious Freedom Act of 1998, or IRFA, requires our State Department to designate any country engaging in particularly severe violations of religious freedom, defined as systematic, ongoing, and egregious, as a country of particular concern, or CPC. If a country meets that threshold, then they should be designated along with appropriate administrative actions to encourage adherence to international human rights norms. India clearly meets these CPC standards under IRFA, not only based on USCIRF's analysis and public reporting, but by the State Department's own annual International Religious Freedom Report, which reiterates the same concerns that I've just laid out here this morning. USCIRF has recommended the State Department designate India as a CPC every year since 2020, and we continue to urge it to do so. Despite the U.S. government's failure so far to designate India as a CPC, there are still some important policy actions that can be taken to address religious freedom concerns about the country. Let me suggest these. First, congressional hearings like this one are an important tool to publicly highlight conditions for religious minorities in India. We encourage members of Congress to continue to publicly raise religious freedom issues in India and to include religious freedom in discussions with government counterparts and, importantly, during congressional delegations. Second, in USCIRF's Frank R. Wolf Freedom of Religion or Belief Victims List, we currently document 25 individuals imprisoned in India related to their religious identity or expression, though in fact the actual number of individuals detained is much higher. However, we urge members of Congress to advocate on behalf of these religious prisoners of conscience and other human rights defenders through public statements, floor speeches, and letters, including through the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission's Defending Freedoms Project. Third, Congress should continue to emphasize the importance of a full investigation into transnational repression allegations outlined in the Department of Justice recent indictment. And fourth and lastly, we recommend that Congress condition financial assistance and arms sales to India on improved religious freedom conditions and include measures for additional review and reporting. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Well, thank you very much for your testimony, and I think you have thoroughly outlined some of the human rights challenges that quite frankly, are a reality in today's India. And I agree with all your recommendations, but you reminded us that USCIRF has recommended the State Department designate India a country of particular concern every year since 2020.
Correct.
It's now 2024, okay? So can you help us understand, what is your understanding of the reasons the State Department has not made that designation?
Congressman McGovern, frankly, I'm unclear why. It bewilders me. Let me say, on the face of it, I mean, if we look at the criteria objectively, India clearly meets all of the criteria. Obviously, you're aware of the geopolitical concerns about our world today, and I suspect that's probably part of what's going on here. But I would point to other countries that I designate as countries of particular concern that are also of interest to us for geopolitical reasons, countries like Pakistan and so forth. Those countries we do list as countries of particular concern, and we grant them a waiver, nevertheless, to work with them outside normal sanctions. I wonder why something like that couldn't be the situation in India. In other words, designated as a country of particular concern. And then if for geopolitical reasons, other measures need to be taken, then perhaps a waiver could be applied.
No, and I think that's a good suggestion. I mean, we're all aware of the geopolitical concerns. We live in a crazy world right now, right? I mean, just turn on the news, it's like drinking water from a fire hose, looking at all the turmoil and all the potential areas where, things that can go off the rails. But I think, it's precisely when countries that we deem as our friend, when countries that are as significant in terms of population and influence as India, it is precisely in those instances where it is really important to state the truth, because if you don't, then what's the incentive for anything to change? There doesn't seem to be very much of an incentive. And I get it. I mean, countries don't, nobody wants to be on this list. And one would hope that, if India were on this list, even if we were to provide a waiver, that they would want to do everything they could to get off this list for the sake of their own global credibility.
The power of the CPC designation is exactly, it provides the leverage for countries to make these kinds of changes. And without making the CPC designation, it's as if we're giving India a free pass.
Well, I appreciate it, and let me yield to our co-chair.
Thank you very much. And Commissioner, thank you for your very powerful testimony. And thank you. I chaired all the hearings on the Frank Wolf International Religious Freedom Act, and the markup began in my subcommittee, went to the full committee, went to the floor, languished over in the Senate for well over a year. We thought they were going to kill it, as so many bills coming out of the House are often killed through inaction. But it did finally get passed and signed into law. And ditto for the Frank Wolf bill that I did, named in honor of that great champion of human rights, Frank Wolf. That, too, went through a very, very tortured path in order to get enacted into law. What I learned during those early hearings was that the State Department on human rights in general and religious freedom in particular so often sees it as a nuisance. That's why Frank, in his original bill and in mine, enhanced State Department training for people, FSOs, and everybody else right on down the line, right up until DCMs and the ambassadors, because there is this dismissiveness that is so rampant about, again, human rights in general and religious freedom in particular, that's just put that aside and don't worry about it. I have asked Secretary Blinken, and I don't know what the answer is to why. I've asked Husain and others who run the IRFA office for a good explanation as to why they have rejected your recommendation for CPC designation. I have said repeatedly, friends don't let friends commit human rights abuses, and we are enabling by our silence. You have been outstanding, and I love when you put out your rationales. You lay it all out in such vivid detail. It's an engraved invitation, I believe, for the administration to say, but of course, as there's prescribed about, and it's a 1-2 operation. Name them for what they are, call it for what it is, and they are a country of particular concern, and I would put an H in there, huge particular concern for their egregious behavior. And Modi looks at what we do and says they don't care. And that's what the takeaway is by his government and by he personally. So I would encourage you to continue on. We keep asking, we get crickets as to what the rationale is for this, and geopolitical concerns are enhanced, I believe, and the ability for us to have credibility. And when we name countries on CPC and exclude egregious violators like India, what does that say to the other countries that are on the list? They look at us as hypocrites, and that's not good either. Credibility is all important. And as you know, it's a 1-2 operation. The first operation is a designation based on the record. The second is what the State Department itself and the President decide to do in enforcing it, starting with a simple démarche and all the other important embedded penalties that are in that law. So I would hope, and I thank you for your list of the 25. without objection, I would hope that you would include that or provide that to us just so it's in the record, so that we have a clear, all those important names. And of course, as you said, there are many more that we know about. But I have tried repeatedly, and next time Secretary comes up, I'm going to be asking him again about India. I'm also going to be asking about other countries, including in Africa, Nigeria, which, where more Christians have been killed. 90% of all the Christians killed, murdered for their faith, happens in that country. And the current government, again, looks askance. And we have all kinds of relationship with them. We do this, they'll take note. But again, we're talking India today, and I just hope we do this. And there is a pattern here. Again, I'm the author of the trafficking laws for the United States of America, including the landmark one. I can't believe they're not Tier 3. Minimally, they should be on the watch list for their trafficking, and that especially includes labor trafficking, but sex trafficking as well. It's outrageous, and yet they get a buy on that one. They did not get a buy, thankfully, on their child abduction issue, but that's not as highly profiled as these are. So keep on keeping on, and if you get a sense of what that rationale is, please let us know, because I have not been able to get it. And I just very frustrated and very angry, because the people who are suffering, the Muslims and the Christians and the others, the Sikhs, in Punjab who are suffering, so many are suffering because of this. You called it incredibly concerning, a culture of
Impunity.
Impunity. I can't read my own writing. Culture of impunity. You've called it the way it is. And when Frank did the two-step, having a commission, it was precisely because we did not trust the State Department. That other issues would put this on page 6 of a group of talking points, even if it made the list. So we have a independent, absolutely focused group of men and women serving there that say, let's call it the way it is. So I can't thank you enough for your leadership, and I yield back.
Well, thank you. And let me just say, I think we can all acknowledge that the people at the State Department know that everything you just said and everything that has been told to them is legitimate and real. Yes. I mean, this is not a question of, it's a gray area. I mean, it is clear. The issue is one of political will, and it is frustrating. I mean, I share that frustration that the gentleman from New Jersey just talked about. That, I mean, why don't we just call it as it is? And again, there are ways to soften the blow, if you will, through waivers. But nonetheless, we ought to make it clear that not only do we know what the reality is, but we're willing to call it out. And to not do so, as the gentleman just mentioned, really kind of takes away from those that are on the list, and is kind of a green light, in this case to India, that we really don't have to change. There's no consequence to this. But in any event, we appreciate you being here. Thank you so much. And we will continue to be in touch.
Thank you. If I could close with a personal statement, allow me to salute you both for your extraordinary record for religious freedom around the world. Thank you both, gentlemen.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Now we're going to go to our next panel, Carolyn Nash from Amnesty International USA. Amnesty recently published a report that documented the targeted demolition by the Indian authorities of at least 128 properties, including homes, businesses, and places of worship, largely belonging to Muslims in 5 states, 4 of which are ruled by the BKP party. John Sifton with Human Rights Watch. Let me read the. John is the Asia Advocacy Director at Human Rights Watch. He focuses on South and Southeast Asia, East Asia, and the Middle East, and terrorism and counterterrorism issues worldwide. Dr. Waris Husain, he's a legal advisor for South and Southeast Asia and the ABA, American Bar Association Justice Defenders Program. He was previously a policy analyst at the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, covering South Asia, the South Asia region. Adrian Shahbaz is the Vice President of Research and Analysis at Freedom House, where he oversees the organization's portfolio of annual publications and special reports. Isaac Six is the Senior Director of Advocacy at Global Christian Relief. He has worked on a wide array of human rights and international religious freedom issues, for over a decade, including as a fellow for this commission. And so with that...
Chairman, if I could
sure, yeah, absolutely.
Thank you. There is a China hearing occurring on the Foreign Affairs Committee. I've been asked to be there, so I am going to have to leave. I have all your testimonies, which I'll take and read. And yesterday, just as an example, I chaired my 100th hearing on human rights abuse in the People's Republic of China. I chaired the China Commission, as I mentioned a moment ago, and my good friend here is the ranking member. And we did it on forced organ harvesting and the cruelty of that, killing tens of thousands of Uyghurs and Tibetan Buddhists and especially Falun Gong in order to steal their organs. But it is a worldwide phenomenon. And if any of you could maybe address that vis-a-vis India, because it is a problem there. And I would add that I have a bill that passed the House on March 28th last year. It's languishing over in the Senate, like so many of the things that my co-chairman and I often do. We pass them. It had 2 negative votes. That's it. I mean, talk about bipartisanship. It is a top-to-bottom effort to mitigate the problem of forced organ harvesting. So I would ask you, consider yourself asked about that question when we get to Q&A. But I do have to, I've been asked to get back to this China hearing. So I apologize deeply for not hearing you, but I do have your testimonies. And thank you.
Thank you, and congratulations on your 100th hearing. There's a lot of hearings. Why don't we begin with Ms. Nash?
Thank you to the co-chairs for the opportunity to speak here today regarding the deteriorating situation of human rights in India. Over the last 10 years, Amnesty International and other human rights organizations have documented efforts by BJP authorities to demonize and deny the rights of religious and ethnic groups in India. This includes both rights-violating conduct by the government, such as rhetoric by BJP officials and supporters intended to stoke religious and ethnic violence, protection by state authorities of mobs that commit these violent acts, arrest, detention, and intimidation of government critics, and the use and export of invasive spyware for unlawful surveillance. It also includes the government's weaponization of laws to justify these abuses. Most recently, we saw the operationalization of the Citizenship Amendment Act, which discriminates on the basis of religion and could be used to strip members of religious groups of their citizenship. The Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, which violates fair trial guarantees and allows for prolonged detention without trial. The Foreign Contributions Regulation Act, which facilitates financial harassments of nonprofits. And the Information Technology Act and its corresponding rules, which provide unchecked censorship powers to the Indian government. The Indian government uses these laws to dismantle civil society and target ethnic and religious groups, all while claiming their actions are in line with Indian law and consistent with democratic governance. In fact, what we are witnessing is a government consolidating its power at the expense of the people and the rights that it deems dispensable. Given the urgency of the crisis in India, I would like to reiterate our appreciation to the Commission for holding this hearing. We recognize that the co-chairs will likely be criticized by those who support the emergence of an anti-human rights supremacist India. Today's effort to publicly address the human rights situation in India is a vital responsibility of the U.S. government, in part because the ecosystem I have described is not contained within India's borders. The U.S. government has recognized acts of transnational repression by the government of India in Canada, which led to the assassination of an activist, as well as attempts here in the United States. The scale of oppression facing human rights defenders, both in and out of India, limits the availability of information about human rights violations committed by the Indian government, information that should influence how the U.S. and other governments engage the Modi administration and how the private sector makes choices about investment. My co-panelists and I can provide documentation of the government's intensifying efforts to weaponize and codify into law intolerance and hate. As you will hear from others on this panel, of particular concern are the expansion of the government's abuse of vague and overbroad laws to shut down dissent, the increases in leaders' use of hate speech and vilification of religious groups, and the recent rollout of the CAA and its discriminatory citizenship process, which could set the stage for millions to be deprived of citizenship. It is up to U.S. lawmakers to respond to these efforts, but the situation is worsening quickly, and it would be a mistake to imagine that the U.S. and other concerned governments are geopolitically constrained from taking action. As India prepares for elections, we urge the U.S. government, both members of Congress and administration officials, to communicate to the government of India that the U.S. will condemn hateful rhetoric, legal harassment of civil society, and the targeting of religious and ethnic groups. The BJP party is eager to demonstrate to their base that they are delivering on supremacist promises. We know the lead up to the election will be a particularly dangerous time. We also know that Prime Minister Modi will be particularly sensitive to messages from other governments, and especially from senior leaders. We urge the U.S. to send these messages in several ways. By Congress exercising its oversight role to scrutinize the human rights concerns related to major arms deals with India. By the U.S. raising concerns in multilateral bodies. For example, ensuring that the upcoming evaluation report of India by the Financial Action Task Force, of which the U.S. is a member, directly discusses the misuse of purported counterterrorism and anti-money laundering laws to shut down civil society. By raising human rights issues directly with Indian officials in all bilateral engagements, including the U.S.-India Global Issues Forum. By reiterating that Indian officials will be held accountable for acts of transnational repression within the United States. By acknowledging that the U.S. has its own human rights problems and is willing to have its record criticized. And in all of this, by coordinating closely with other rights-respecting governments to ensure the concerns are being raised on an international level and not only by the U.S. Thank you again, and I welcome your questions.
Thank you very much. Mr. Sifton.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me to testify. I've submitted a written version of my testimony, which is also on our website, Human Rights Watch's website, on our India page, along with several of the reports I'm going to refer to. But to start, however, a word about my organization. Like others on the panel, I just want to be clear that Human Rights Watch is an entirely independent and international organization, and we work in over 100 countries around the world. And that includes India, where we've done work for more than 3 decades, and the United States, where we've reported on human rights abuses since 1978. And we accept no government funding, and we're nonpartisan. We don't endorse political parties. My written testimony reviews an extensive list of human rights issues that we've documented, especially in the last 10 years since Prime Minister Modi's party, the BJP, was elected. I just want to focus on some particular issues about how the government under Prime Minister Modi has essentially undertaken a broad crackdown on civil society and the media, as well as intensifying toxic atmosphere for religious minorities. As I say in my testimony, the government has essentially adopted an increasingly majoritarian form of governance, and it tramples on the rights of religious and ethnic minorities. But the issues go beyond religious freedom. As Carolyn has already outlined and Waris will also discuss, authorities have prosecuted journalists, human rights defenders, peaceful protesters, and they often use, yes, fabricated counterterrorism and hate speech laws. They use hate speech laws against people who are protesting about hate speech by the government or BJP leaders. They've stifled civil society and human rights groups with pretextual investigations and prosecutions. And I also discussed in my written remarks how there's been increasing repression across international borders, which we discussed in a recent hearing as well. But I want to focus again on the more overarching topic, which underpins a lot of these, which concerns both freedom of religion, but also basic freedoms of speech and assembly. The government and the ruling parties' increasingly toxic policies and actions, which target religious minorities and champion this majoritarian political agenda that put the ruling party's goals above all others, they are undergirded by a set of events that have happened over the last 10 years, which I think we should focus on. So to highlight some main points. First, as both the chairs have and Commissioner Schneck have said, the ruling BJP party is encouraging vigilante groups and supporting, in some cases, vigilante groups that engage in violence and hate speech. And sometimes both Muslims and Christians and groups that target minority Christian Kuki in Manipur and many other locations. And BJP leaders, including elected officials, often vilify religious minorities, especially Muslims, in speeches, which has increased vigilante violence. We've also seen widespread police complicity in that violence, dereliction of duty in protecting victims, and cases where the police and authorities go after victim communities after they've suffered abuses, which is the subject of recent reporting by Amnesty, as well as other groups. And then, of course, we've seen these cases of excessive force against farmers who were protesting against agricultural problems. Predominantly Sikh farmers in Delhi and other locations have been subjected to these extreme forms of police violence, and more worryingly, BJP leaders have dangerously labeled them as separatists. And we should note also the impacts of when the government revoked the constitutional status of Muslim-majority Jammu and Kashmir. And I've gone into detail about what those impacts were in terms of mass arrests, internet shutdown, and a total communications blackout, which had severe repercussions for people throughout Jammu and Kashmir. I talk also about the issues in which the BJP and the government have raised tensions with respect to the site of the former Babri Mosque, and the violence that occurred in January after Prime Minister Modi officiated over the opening of a new Hindu temple there. Thousands have been killed in connection with this site, and it deserves attention as well as an aggravating factor. But sixth, and my chief focus of my testimony, is the government's plan to move ahead with a citizenship verification process. And this is connected with this new law, the Citizenship Amendment Act, which was passed in 2019, but which is now has implementing regulations that will make it possible to implement it, and this other issue, the National Registry of Citizenship, or citizens. This is a complicated issue. I try to get into the basics in my written testimony, but the basis of it is that the proposed citizenship process, the NRC, creates a highly problematic system in which local officials are given the power to label a person's citizenship as doubtful or otherwise challenge it. And this is what sets the stage, potentially, for stripping huge numbers of Indians of their citizenship. This connects to the Citizenship Amendment Act, the CAA, because that law, which is ostensibly a citizenship law meant to fast-track processing of people eligible for citizenship from Afghanistan and Pakistan and Bangladesh, it excludes Muslims. And as the BJP supporters have made numerous statements about Muslims from those countries as quote-unquote infiltrators, migrants, foreigners, then stating that the law is only for Hindus, Sikhs, Christians, and other minorities who are non-Muslim in those neighboring countries, this language demonizes Muslims. Infiltrators is a key word that the Home Minister Amit Shah has used. He's said illegal immigrants are like termites, and they are eating the food that should go to our poor, and they are taking our job. They carry out blasts, bombings in our countries, and so many of our people die. In other words, it's clear that the new amendments to the citizenship law are discriminatory. And when they are connected with the registration process, the NRC, they create a system in which millions of Muslims, especially in border areas, could be rendered stateless. It creates a system, essentially, where the burden of proof is reversed on longstanding citizens of India who might be called upon to prove that they're citizens, prove their parents were born in India, and do so in cases in which government officials have made no allegations otherwise. This is really a recipe for disaster, and we've seen how these problems have already unfolded in the state of Assam on the Bangladesh border. When the Citizenship Act was initially enacted in 2009, widespread protests broke out because, protesters noted, the citizenship laws in Assam had been compiled in a very shambolic and arbitrary way, and were missing well over 1 million people who are citizens. And Human Rights Watch and Amnesty documented that the processes used to set up that list in the first place, these citizenship laws, were arbitrary, discriminatory, inconsistent, and error-ridden, and there was no real method to appeal the decisions. There were tribunals, but they operated without any uniform standards, and they were led poorly by officials who have no legal or judicial experience. So in other words, you have local leaders making decisions about whether you're a citizen of India or not. And some individuals are reported to provide documentary evidence going back 50 years, a particularly difficult burden for marginalized communities who often lack documentation of where they were born, where their parents were born. So this process in Assam that rendered over 1 million people stateless, most of them were Muslim, and now this new law, the CAA, would not even give them a pathway to citizenship because they are Muslim. So this is essentially the problem. India's reputation as a rights-respecting, pluralistic country is now really at risk. And so long as the government continues to be guided by these discriminatory, exclusionary, and intolerant approaches to governance, this is going to continue to be a problem. And as long as the government elevates a particular religious group over the rest. So what should we do about it? Carolyn has made a number of excellent recommendations. I would only add a few beyond urging the government to change all this, specifically focus on this National Register of Citizenships issue and the Citizenship Amendment Act, and ask India to turn away from this terrible approach of making Indian citizens prove their citizenship when there's no allegation made otherwise. And of course, repeal all the other laws that discriminate against Muslims and are abused, as I think Waris will talk about, in the name of counterterrorism. Chair Smith raised the issue of trafficking. I just wanted to alert the committee that a major report by the Associated Press was released yesterday about forced labor in the shrimp industry. And given the fact that 40% of shrimp eaten in America is coming from India now, this is an area that government can explore too. Congress could write to Customs and Border Protection and ask questions about enforcement, forced labor laws, and raise that. But look, most importantly on this larger toxic issue, I think Congress needs to more forcefully urge the President Biden, to speak directly to Prime Minister Modi about these concerns. And it's ultimately Prime Minister Modi who has the power to instruct his government, his party, about their toxic rhetoric and their abusive laws and policies, and get them to drop this abusive form of governance. Members of Congress and President Biden need to acknowledge the scope and gravity of this situation. President Biden's embrace of Modi and reluctance to criticize the government for this situation will be understood by India to mean that the worsening conduct will have no consequences, and that cannot be the situation. So my last point would merely be that doing so, failing to say anything to Prime Minister Modi about this deteriorating situation, sends a terrible message that the U.S. government cares more about him, about Modi as a leader, than about the people of India whom Modi was elected to serve. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Husain.
Chairman McGovern, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today and before the Commission. Before I begin, let me state that my remarks reflect my personal opinion and should not be construed as representing the policy of the American Bar Association at large. In October 2023, the Center for Human Rights at the American Bar Association released a report on the adverse impact of counterterrorism laws on human rights defenders and the Financial Action Task Force compliance of India. We'll call it FATF. The report reflects the views of the authors, who are experts in India's relationship with FATF and its use of counterterrorism laws. Based on this report, I will discuss the problem of the misuse of counterterrorism laws and measures in India today, and the impact that such practices have on achieving peace and security goals. India became a member of FATF in 2010 and has since risen in prominence in FATF. FATF is an international organization of states combating terrorism and terrorism financing, which dates back to 1989 and then was given authorization for the counterterrorism financing in 2001. India has repeatedly amended its anti-terrorism and money laundering laws, allegedly to be in compliance with FATF requirements. In doing so, however, India has expanded the scope of these laws in ways that have resulted in wide-ranging adverse impacts on nonprofit organizations, or NPOs, as well as human rights defenders who have been targeted with prosecutions and, in many instances, for exercising their civic freedoms and critiquing the government. From the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, the UAPA, the Prevention of Money Laundering Act, the PMLA, and the Foreign Contribution Regulation Act, the FCRA, which constitute major parts of India's counterterrorism regime, critics have argued that these laws define terrorism in such a vague and imprecise way that they have been used to punish nonviolent political activity, rendering human rights defenders, political opponents, and dissenters vulnerable to malicious prosecution. A survey of human rights defenders' cases who have been prosecuted under these laws demonstrates how the government of India has used its amended counterterrorism financing legislation to target human rights defenders and to close civic space in the country. The first trend begins at the onset of cases, wherein the investigating officers and others involved in the police process use vague allegations and inconsistent evidence to attempt to punish human rights defenders, NPOs, and NGOs that are critical of the ruling government. This harassment was seen in the case of Wahidul Rahman Para, a former journalist, social activist, and current president of the youth wing of People's Democratic Party in Jammu and Kashmir, as well as other cases of Kashmiri human rights defenders. The second trend, which is particularly concerning, in my opinion, is that the punishment is oftentimes meant to be the process itself. Individuals are arrested, they are given extensive pretrial detention, repeatedly denied bail, and their cases could take years to be resolved in the court and could involve multiple rounds of appeals to various courts. Once again, I emphasize that the process here is in fact the punishment. This was seen in the case of Sadiq Kapan, who was charged under the UAPA and the PMLA. Kapan, who spent a total of 2 years in pre-trial detention, remained in jail even after the Supreme Court granted his bail. Extensive pre-trial detention is also exemplified by the Pima Corrigan case, where individuals, including poets, academics, and others who stood in opposition to the current ruling administration, have spent over 5 years in pre-trial detention for charges under the UAPA. This process as punishment concept stands in contravention of both FATF's requirements, as well as international human rights law, and that call for the respect of due process, fair trial rights for individuals. The continued treatment of human rights defenders and certain NPOs and NGOs in this manner could, in my opinion, result in a silencing of political opinion in the country, which will not only impact democracy, but also the rule of law and the credibility of India as an international partner in counterterrorism. As has been demonstrated above in my testimony, India has used its FATF compliance as a justification for expanding its counterterrorism financing laws, which has rendered them overbroad, vague, and susceptible to misuse. The increasing scope of these laws has facilitated the persecution of human rights defenders and has often led to a failure by the Indian government to engage in an objective, risk-based assessment when enforcing laws such as those required by FATF. In my opinion, which does not reflect the ABA's overall policy, in order to retain its long-running security relationship with India, US policymakers must raise these issues with their Indian counterparts to ensure that India remains an effective partner that isn't directing resources and laws that are meant to fight terrorism and its financing in a political manner against human rights defenders and NGOs. I thank you for my time and welcome questions.
Thank you. Mr. Shahbaz?
Thank you. Can you hear me okay? Great. Thank you, Co-Chair McGovern, and my gratitude to Co-Chair Smith and the members of the Commission for the opportunity to testify today. Freedom House has been evaluating the state of political rights and civil liberties in India for over 50 years, as we do with every country in the world. Through our annual Freedom in the World report, India is the world's largest democracy with a history of pluralistic governance and a robust constitution. However, we've tracked a decline in freedoms over the past decade, with the country losing 11 points in our 100-point index. And in 2021, we changed the country's rating from free to partly free. This democratic backsliding has been driven by 3 negative trends that I'll go through today. First, a crackdown on freedom of expression. Second, restrictions on civic space. And third, concerns around the rule of law. Many of these negative trends are the results of policies enacted by Prime Minister Narendra Modi and the ruling BJP, and it's a pattern that we see in many countries undergoing significant backsliding around the world. Let me start with the crackdown on free expression, with a particular emphasis on the internet. India hosts a lively and diverse online environment with some 865 million people using the internet. But India's score has dropped by 10 points since 2015 in our Freedom on the Net Index, which measures human rights online. The government has passed a series of new rules that require social media platforms to quickly remove content that is deemed illegal, as well as content identified as fake or false by a government-run fact-checking unit. You hear that right. This is translated into an uptick in political censorship, particularly content that is perceived as critical of the Prime Minister, the ruling party, or its broader social policies. In just the first 2 months of 2024, authorities have taken down a popular magazine's reporting on state violence in Jammu and Kashmir. They have restricted over a dozen social media accounts linked to the leaders of a farmers' protest, and blocked 2 websites dedicated to tracking hate crimes and hate speech in India. In full disclosure, we have also been notified by Twitter, or now X, that they have received requests to restrict posts by Freedom House in the country. This increased censorship, combined with internet shutdowns and politicized investigations, have also impacted the ability of civil society to operate freely. India is the world leader in shutting down the internet, with blackouts sometimes lasting hundreds of days. These disproportionate restrictions not only have a significant impact on people's abilities to access healthcare, continue education, and run businesses, but they curtail political and civil liberties. Like my colleagues, we have noted the controversial use of tax and finance laws to curb the activities of nonprofit organizations and the media. This general pattern around the timing and the targets of these investigations raises significant concerns that administrative resources are being disproportionately used to target the political opposition and BJP critics. One example of this, from last year, in January 2023, the central government restricted access to a BBC documentary that examined whether Prime Minister Modi did enough to stop inter-religious clashes in the state of Gujarat in 2002, when he was its chief minister. And only 1 month later, tax officials raided 2 of BBC India's offices and questioned staff members. Authorities have also launched probes under the Foreign Contribution Regulation Act, or FCRA, against organizations that report critically on the government. The third negative trend relates to concerns around the rule of law. The Supreme Court in India has played an important role in safeguarding fundamental rights, but in recent years, Prime Minister Modi has broken norms around judicial appointments, and observers have noted increased political interference in decisions. It reached the point that in 2018, 4 senior members of the court took the unprecedented step of publicly raising concerns about judicial independence. Several recent and upcoming judicial decisions are likely to have outsized impact on democracy and human rights in the country, particularly ahead of elections that are starting in the coming months. These include rulings on the Citizenship Amendment Act, whether a government fact-checking unit actually has the authority to censor content online, and a tax investigation of the main opposition party, whose accounts are partly frozen ahead of this general election. In closing, I wanted to outline several possible measures that Congress could take to stall further backsliding in India. First, raise issues of concerns related to human rights and democracy directly with Indian officials in all meetings at all levels. Advocate for the release of those unjustly imprisoned for their religious speech, political speech, or social opinions. It's so important, as we've heard throughout the testimony today, that the future of democracy in India has enormous implications, not only for the people of India, but globally. Second, to urge the Indian government to respect human rights online, specifically to refrain from imposing connectivity restrictions or blocks on social media platforms, and to refrain from censoring expression that is protected under international human rights law. Also, to enshrine standards to govern the use of commercial spyware products. Third, to urge the Indian government to ensure that the conduct of the 2024 elections are free and fair, specifically to ensure that opposition politicians, candidates, and parties can engage in campaigning without fear of arrest, suspension, or other restrictions on their liberty. To refrain from using state resources to privilege the ruling party, as set out in India's Model Code of Conduct, and to ensure that neutral election observers from internationally accredited organizations and reputable domestic groups are invited to monitor the totality of election processes without any undue restrictions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Last but certainly not least, Mr. Six, welcome. I should welcome back.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair McGovern, and it's good to be back. Chair Smith, also thank you for the invitation to testify, and members of the Lantos Commission for holding this hearing and for inviting GCR. The Commission truly is a beacon of light in Congress on matters of human rights, and one I'm proud to have worked for in years past. I took this photo nearly 9 years ago In the photo, a congressional staffer and I are sitting in a dark room in a small village in the Indian state of Chhattisgarh. The room is dark on purpose. Extremists had been terrorizing members of the religious minority whom we had come to interview and were threatening to return. So we conducted the interview in secret. Some of the men in the image had been ordered to attend a Garwapsi, or homecoming ceremony, essentially forcing them to convert to Hinduism. When they refused, they were attacked and beaten by members of the Vishva Hindu Parishad. In the 9 years since that photo was taken, nothing has changed. We received more reports of attacks on religious minorities in states like Chhattisgarh and Uttar Pradesh than we can possibly publish. These reports include testimonies of forced conversions, the destruction of places of worship, kidnapping, sexual assault, and sometimes fatal mob violence. These pieces of anecdotal evidence pointing to serious religious freedom concerns are supported by a much wider body of data. In addition to all of the reports referenced by my fellow panelists, the Pew Research Center rates India in the top 7 of all countries for social hostility on the basis of religion. The United Christian Forum, a Delhi-based human rights group, documented 720 attacks on just Christian minorities in 2023. Global Christian Relief's own Violent Incident Database, which was launched this year to track violent incidents of persecution in every country and involving every faith community, show violent incidents against religious minorities in India sometimes involved hundreds or even thousands of victims. Undergirding much of this violence is a pernicious legal framework that favors extremists in the religious majority. The passage and enforcement of anti-conversion laws in 12 of India's 28 states, ostensibly to protect citizens from forced religious conversions, has in effect criminalized conversions from any faith except those into Hinduism. Hundreds of Christian leaders, often from scheduled castes and tribes, have been arrested under these laws and countless more attacked for exercising the basic right to tell other people about their deeply held beliefs. The most shocking aspect of all of this is how little any of it reflects what I believe India truly is: a beautiful, pluralistic nation where respect for others' religious beliefs is a deeply ingrained cultural value. In fact, 84% of Indians say respecting all religions is, quote, very important to being truly Indian, end quote. How do we reconcile these two seemingly contradictory positions? By recognizing that most religious violence is instigated by a small faction within Indian society. And herein also lies the answer to addressing these issues. There is, and I recognize the weight of this statement in a hearing like this, but there is only so much that can be done from outside of India. Congress and members of this commission should apply pressure on the Biden administration to accept USCIRF's recommendations and designate India a country of particular concern. Congress and the administration should identify Indian government agencies and officials responsible for severe religious freedom and other human rights violations and enact targeted sanctions against those entities. But more importantly, we must support the efforts of Indians themselves to address these issues and reconcile their differences. It must be made clear the negative actions I've just mentioned are intended to be temporary and to go hand in hand with a positive offer to work together in addressing concerns. We must emphasize the long-standing values that the vast majority of Americans and Indians have shared for decades and refuse to divide ourselves along fractious political lines, theirs or ours. In the end, as Chair Smith said repeatedly this morning, friends don't let friends commit human rights abuses. We have a responsibility to speak up, but mostly we have a responsibility to support the overwhelming majority of Indians looking for a better future. Lasting change can and only will come from them. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, I have a few questions, but I don't have a lot of time, and Congresswoman Omar has some questions as well, so if I can just, some of these are just yes or no answers, but I think it's important to get this on the record. First of all, Co-Chair Smith, raised the issue of organ harvesting. Does anyone want to comment on any of that? Mr. Sifton? No? Okay. Oh, if you get back to us, it'll be fine. Let me ask you this, just a yes or no, we just go right down the list. Do any of you see India as having a robust and independent press still? I mean, I'll just go, Ms. Nash? Sifton?
It does not have an independent
All right, okay, all right.
press. There are independent journalists who are still reporting, but they're doing so while having to exercise bravery and a lot of resources to defend themselves legally, and so I wouldn't call it independent, no.
Yeah, or robust at this particular point, given the fact, I mean, I think we are all in agreement on anybody dissent on that. I just want to get the record straight here, so we're all clear.
And lots of charges against journalists, criminal
Right.
charges that are being brought
Okay.
against those journalists for telling the truth. So.
China seems to be a factor in the hesitancy to publicly raise concerns about human rights abuses in India. Is this reasonable? Is there a risk that public criticism could push India closer to China or backfire in some other way? I open this to anybody. No. Ms. Nash?
I mean, I think there are a number of risks. I think the risks need to be in line with kind of what we're seeing as a trajectory here. So, for example, the arms deal that was recently approved, the $4 billion arms deal the U.S. approved with Hellfire missiles and Reaper drones, those will be delivered to India 4 years from now, about 4 years from now. We can look at the last 10 years and see how India has changed and see the things you just heard about become increasingly worrying. That means when we're thinking about what India looks like as our geopolitical partner in anything, whether it's China or anything else, we're talking about the India of 4 years down the line, if this is not interrupted, having access to those weapons, and we being the people who supplied them. I just, regionally speaking, I also want to broaden it. It's not only a question of China, there's also a question of the impact that this particular Indian government at this moment is having on the crisis in Myanmar. So just to briefly highlight that there are tens of thousands of Rohingya refugees who have fled into India, who face constant threat of forced return to Myanmar while it is in the middle of a violent civil war.
Yeah. And, you know, I'm raising this concern, going back to what Mr. Schneck said, you know, we talked about earlier, how USCIRF, you know, continues to recommend to the State Department that they designate India as a country of particular concern, but yet we don't do it. So is it China? Well, I'm trying to think, what is the?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So on that front, let's look at the other countries that have not been listed, even though that it's been recommended, including Vietnam, including Turkey. This is an India hearing, so let's talk about India. In that context, when we worry about administrations, and it's not just this one, soft pedaling on India, it's a concern that India is joining, has joined, and is a participant of institutions like BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India. The idea that BRICS will expand and become a institution which undermines human rights are real, but also undermine the United States' national interests, which is no concern of Human Rights Watch's, but is, you know, a concern of the Biden administration's. These are real concerns that they have, but what we're trying to convince the administration is that it's not a zero-sum game. You can do both. India is not going to run away if they get criticized for these concerning issues. And in fact, the theory we have here is not just to raise human rights for the sake of raising human rights, but precisely because doing so will not result in them running away and will result in them, the leadership of the BJP and Prime Minister Modi, instructing their government officials and their leaders to tone down the vilification, tone down the abuse and misuse of laws to target critics, and let the country be a little bit more vibrant and pluralistic.
Mr. Shahbaz?
Wanted to take 2 quick points. One is just very quickly that strong democracies make for better security partners. The second point is that authoritarianism doesn't have borders. And we know, given the incidents of transnational repression that were already referenced, one that took place in Canada and an attempt in the United States, that authoritarianism can threaten the freedom and security of Americans here at home as well. Thanks.
And I go to Mr. Six and then Mr. Husain after that, but as you answer your question, I just want to add one more thing. I mean, you argued that the U.S. should support the efforts of Indians themselves to address the human rights and religious freedom issues that we're discussing today. And do you have any specific recommendations on how best to provide such support?
I do.
So throw that in after you answer this question.
Sure. So let me answer the first question. I do think there's a risk that India, talking about these issues and the U.S. administration moving forward on these issues could risk jeopardizing U.S. national interests. I'm an idealist, though. I believe that we have to, regardless of whether it does. That's, though, why I couched the country of particular concern designation is often seen as this shaming tool. And it is to a certain extent. However, it was never intended to be a permanent tool where we list countries forever and say, you are a terrible country and we're not going to improve. The goal is to work with the country to help them get off of those lists. And so I think that needs to be carefully framed in the messaging about CPC recommendations, and including in communications with the Biden administration on this. As far as the answer to how we work more closely with those in India, I mean, first and foremost, if we could get the Foreign Contribution Regulations Act amended a bit to allow for more help from outside of the country, that would be fantastic. But my strongest recommendation, and ties into my testimony, is we need more CODELs and staff DELs to the country. Those relationships are incredibly productive. You meet with both Indian officials, but also meet with those who've suffered from human rights violations and help bridge that gap, bridge the understanding. So if I could make one recommendation, it would be we need to increase the relationships between Congress and Indian government officials in that way.
Mr. Husain, you want to add something?
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. The question about security partnerships is an important one, obviously, and it's something that everyone is considering, from State Department to folks on the Hill as well. I think the importance that we bring through our report at the ABA, and in my personal opinion, you can't have a security partner that's using their counterterrorism laws to silence their opponents and still rely on them as security partners that can deliver on the promises that they've made to you, right? So I think that's one of the major issues that we need to consider, that when this framework of laws is being used or abused against individuals who are being critical of the government, then they can't spend those same resources that they would need to be a good security partner. So it actually makes sense in the sense of the two overlap, actually. A security partnership with a country that respects human rights will make it a better security partnership.
I just got a couple more questions, and I'll yield to Congressman Omar. Mr. Sifton, you mentioned in your testimony that the implementation of the National Register of Citizens, together with the Citizenship Amendment Act, could render millions of Muslims stateless. For the record, I think we're trying to get this record full here. For the record, what are the implications of being stateless?
It's difficult to say how it would pan out on the ground in particular border areas of India. But I mean, let's say already in the state of Assam, hundreds of thousands of Muslims are right now without any real documentation that they are citizens of India. It's been challenged that they are, and they have not been included in this initial registry. If that were to then be attached to some effort to deport them for being non-citizens, it would be a catastrophic situation. And if that process that was undertaken in Assam was then replicated in other areas, the situation would become worse. But I mean, it's not just that there has a process that reverses the burden of proof. We can talk, I mean, this is going on right now in Texas about who's supposed to provide which proof to whom and what. It's that the process for sorting it out is arbitrary and is conducted by people who have no legal or judicial background. So it's completely symbolic.
Mr. Shahbaz?
Thank you, Congressman. I just wanted to make one further point to that, which is that India is going through a rapid digitalization process where they're providing biometric IDs to Indians, and then those IDs and registration is required to access any number of government services. And so by being stateless, by not having the identification possible, it essentially makes people, it's hard to say a second-class citizen, but not a citizen, right? So they're ineligible to access and to really conduct normal activities of everyday life.
He just has one more question to Mr. Husain. And so this is, by the way, we're having this hearing in the Rules Committee. And if you haven't figured it out by now, we don't have any time limits in the Rules Committee, so it goes on forever, right? But I have to be at an appointment at 11:30, and then so Ilhan Omar can go on forever if she wants. I'm just telling you, this is in the Rules Committee. Yeah, I gotta go to another committee. Yeah, but let me just, Mr. Hussain, you argued that the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, the Prevention of Money Laundering Act, and the Foreign Contribution Regulation Act, all of which are part of India's counterterrorism legislation, define terrorism so vaguely and imprecisely that they are being used to punish nonviolent political activity. Can you just say a little bit more about the definition of terrorism that's being used? And do you have examples of language that lends itself to this overly broad implementation?
Yeah, so we can point to Section 15 of the UAPA, which has been amended over time and now includes other unlawful activity, which can be a litany of other things that aren't related to terrorism or any other things that are related to the actual fighting or counterterrorism policies. There are other provisions that are left so vague and imprecise, and they continue to be amended over time and made more imprecise and more broad. But I would say that Section 15 of the UAPA is certainly a place where it's very concerning that the definition has gone far beyond, I think, what we would consider as terrorism or terrorism financing.
Let me just conclude, and then I'll yield to Congresswoman Omar. Look, I want to be clear, for those who are critical of us doing this hearing, that our intention here is to basically work with a friend to do better. I mean, we want to have a relationship with India. This is not about cutting off relationships. This is about encouraging a relationship that that we have trust in, and that respects human rights. And I think it's not only good for our relationship, I think it's good for India as a country, right? And I think everybody's making that case. And things are not going in the right direction. Things are very concerning. That's why we're doing this hearing, because we are concerned. And that is why many of us, will continue to urge the administration to make the designation that India is as a country of particular concern. And we will continue to raise the questions as to why they're not doing that in light of all of the evidence. Clearly, they're not doing it because they don't want to, make any waves. That's just not a good enough excuse. We need to be consistent on human rights. And by the way, not just with regard to, our human rights in India, but also human rights in Gaza right now. And I mean, you name the country, right? The places where we're sometimes hesitant because we don't want to ruffle anybody's feathers. But if we're not consistent, then we're not going to be effective. And so I just want to make clear, I mean, the approach that we are taking here is one of, as a friend, Congressman Smith said, if friends don't let friends commit human rights abuses. I think that is done with respect, and that is done with the hope that our relationship will get stronger. If things don't change, then there will be problems, and then there will be more and more efforts for Congress to, limit certain kinds of aid and actually, change the nature of our relationship. We don't want to go that way, and quite frankly, India is a big enough country, is a vibrant enough country. They ought not to have to resort to human rights abuses or repression or discrimination to try to be able to continue. So I thank all of you for your testimony, and I'm happy now to yield the rest of my time to Congresswoman Ilhan Omar.
The time that can go on forever, I guess. Thank you, Chairman McGovern. I really do appreciate you calling this hearing, and thanks to Chairman Smith. I echo the sentiments of Chairman McGovern. I think it is important for us to state that for the record. It is not that we are an enemy of India when we ask these questions. It's because we deeply care as a friend, as an ally. And, of course, for many of us, we've been concerned over the last several years about the treatment that Muslims and Christians are receiving in India. But I'm also increasingly concerned about the situation in Punjab and the treatment of the Sikhs. Of course, most notoriously, there was a plot by the Indian government to murder a Sikh American activist last year, and a successful plot to murder a Sikh activist in Canada. The Indian government claims that it's just politics, and it should be accepted as politics. But are you, and this is to Nash and Sifton, are you worried that this is really starting to come down to Sikhs as a whole?
What's been going on with the protests involving Sikh farmers is one thing. What's been going on with alleged separatists overseas, I think, is a slightly separate thing. But in both cases, what we see is a demonization of a particular religious minority as other, as separatists, as somehow not the same as Indian citizens. And it is those broad blanket statements that were made about both protesting farmers, Sikh, as well as Sikhs who are in the diaspora, that is of concern as far as religious liberty goes. As far as the effects of transnational repression, there was a separate hearing earlier about that worldwide, but which I spoke about India. And the most alarming thing about the allegations there with respect to the murder for hire plot in New York and the successful killings in Canada are that they dovetail with a set of repressive acts that India has been doing for diaspora of a softer nature, like revoking their overseas Indian origin cards or revoking the visas, the passports of Indian citizens who are outside the country. These are terrifying things to deal with if you're a diaspora person. And there's other forms of threats as well. But the most insidious thing about all of this is that what it leads to is policymakers, your colleagues, not hearing from constituents who care about this because they're afraid. They're afraid to tell you and other members of Congress that they have concerns about the Indian government because they're afraid that if they do that, they or their family members may face this type of repression. And that has an impact on the entire U.S.-India relationship because too many members of Congress are perhaps themselves reluctant to raise issues with the Biden administration and with the Indian government about their concerns. And that, in some ways, is the most insidious impact of all this repression, not just the transnational repression, but also the repression of journalists in the country. And I would add that I was asked about Indian journalists and the Indian press, but the repression also impacts American and European and other journalists who, both in Delhi and here in Washington, Sabrina Siddiqui, the Wall Street Journal, have faced serious attacks for their reporting or their questioning on India, which, again, has this impact on the policymaking here in Washington because people aren't hearing the unvarnished truth.
Yeah, Nash and Husain, do you want to?
I would echo all that. The only thing I'll add to broaden it, I mean, I agree absolutely that the ways in which we see repression manifest are in part used so that others will know that that's available, that that's on the table. And we really do see that in our work. But I want to kind of broaden that to what it means to be an Amnesty or a Human Rights Watch. You know, our organizations have both struggled in some ways to be able to keep doing our work. Amnesty's office bank accounts were frozen in 2020, forcing a halt to our operations. And it's been difficult to resume work, and certainly it's not possible in the same way. And I'm flagging that not because it's a problem for Amnesty, but because you can be absolutely sure that if Amnesty is struggling, the local civil society partners who we depend on everywhere we work are facing something exponentially worse than we are. And that's certainly the case here. And so I think we often, a lot of the attention comes to these particular moments, whether it's a particular case or in our case, a particular organization. But this is a situation where it's almost like the opposite of the canary in the coal mine. It's not a warning of what's to come. It's a wake-up call for the devastation that people are already suffering in the country and more in the diaspora as well.
Yeah.
I think in my personal opinion, what I would say here is that the group of people that are being otherized in the country keeps expanding, right? And so it's more and more restrictive as time goes on. And from a legal perspective, you know, for anyone as a group who is standing up and protesting against the government, what we see as a response from the government, oftentimes, in my personal opinion, is that, you know, they're repressed and persecuted and prosecuted through the criminal justice system. So if you have now, as the Sikhs have been part of the farmers' movement, have been protesting against the government, you are now increasingly going to be subject to some kind of criminal prosecution or persecution, including, you know, charges which I've discussed here under counterterrorism and sedition, where you could face up to 2 to 3 years of just pretrial detention. We're not talking about the settlement of your case, and you're literally waiting for them to decide your case, and you can be in jail for 2 to 3 years. So that's the cost of protesting at this point, whether you're from the Sikh community or from other communities, but that pool of otherization does seem to be increasing in a very disturbing way.
I might just add, thank you, Congresswoman.
Yeah, I didn't know if you were 6 months.
I wanted to add, because you mentioned transnational repression, that it's just very alarming to see the Indian government, by all accounts, joining a group of governments engaging in this tactic that is a fundamental skirting of the rule of law, joining the ranks of China, Russia, Saudi Arabia, to see the incidents come to light of the killing in Canada and then the attempt in the United States. For a country that is, you know, a democracy, to be engaging in that is very concerning.
Very quickly, I'll just
Didn't
add.
want to leave you out.
Thank you. No, very quickly, I'll add, I think it's really key that this hearing was happening, primarily because there's been efforts even in Washington, D.C. to intimidate members of NGO communities and this commission years past into not holding events like this. The last time I was involved with a hearing with the Lantos Commission in 2016, we had to have Capitol Hill police present because of fears of threats. And so it's really critical that groups like the Lantos Commission and the civil society groups here don't allow those threats to stop us from talking about these issues.
Mr. Shahbaz, a lot of times people who defend our partnership with India talk a lot about democratic norms and values. But in your testimony, I think you made it quite clear that those norms and values are being eroded by Modi's government. What kind of long-term structural damage to India's institutions has been done?
Thank you, Congresswoman. Yes, so as I mentioned, India has been on the decline in our Freedom in the World Index. I mentioned the three areas that have driven that decline around a crackdown on free expression, civic space, and the rule of law. If I were to just unpack this a bit more, this is part of a playbook that we're seeing happen in so many countries that are experiencing significant democratic backsliding, which is that once a party is elected, they go about essentially tilting the playing field so that no other opposition can compete anymore. There are so many examples of this currently taking place, and we're only just a month out of a massive general election. So the concern here is that we're used to seeing democratic backsliding happen as in a very dramatic fashion, where there's a coup, there's a suspension of parliament. That's rarely the case these days. Today, what democratic backsliding tends to look like is almost death by 1,000 cuts, where it's just year after year after year of gradual erosion of checks and balances, an expansion of executive power, and a crackdown on civic groups and independent media who are no longer able to play that role of being a check on the worst instincts of those in power. Checks and balances within a society are fundamental for guarding against abuse, guarding against corruption. And what we're seeing instead is that disproportionately, there are tax and other financial rules that are being used selectively to target the political opposition and those that are critics of Prime Minister Modi and the BJP. So I think we need to think about democratic backsliding perhaps differently than what we all read in the history books. And that's what we're seeing today in India. That's what we find so alarming, because it's almost like the frog being boiled in the pot of water, where at a certain point it's going to be too late. And I think it's right. It's so great that we're all here today, and able to talk, to a friend, and in order to hopefully reverse some of this democratic backsliding.
Thank you. And Mr. Sifton and Ms. Nash, you mentioned earlier the $4 billion that the State Department just approved in arms sales. It's drones for surveillance. Can you maybe share some of the specific concerns about this arms deal beyond the general concerns? Like, what does it mean? What are the human rights implications for this deal when it comes to Indian security forces at all?
I'm going to let John talk in some detail about this, but I do want to say that part of it is that this is an opportunity. So I mentioned that there will be a time lag before these arrive. There was an opportunity for Congress to require simply things like notifications. And these would send important signals, notifications of pre-delivery. So it would give the opportunity for the U.S. to review the circumstances when it was time to actually make that delivery. Those kind of steps are not interrupting the security relationship, but they would send strong messages that there's enough oversight on this relationship to condition or to slow down some of it, and to recognize that there's an awareness of a trajectory and concern about where things seem to be going. But if you want to speak more about it.
Yeah, I think on these arms deals, I mean, first, we want to separate the use of the weapon to commit human rights from the fact that the weapons deal of any type took place at this size. As far as the use goes, I mean, I can't opine on whether or not things will happen the way they're supposed to, but technically these are supposed to be utilized for both maritime and border security. The weapons platforms come with a significant suite of lethal weapons, including Hellfire and Hellfire missiles and bombs, but they're technically supposed to be surveillance drones. And they're not supposed to be utilized for internal conflict, and so thus we wouldn't expect, if all was to go according to the way it's supposed to, they would be used in a place like Kashmir or on the Pakistani border. But the fact is, Congress has a role to play in asking tough questions about whether this deal makes sense, given the fact that this is a country which has just been accused of being involved in a murder-for-hire plot in New York City, has a deteriorating human rights situation. The U.S. Commission of International Religious Freedom has just recommended it be listed for country of particular concern, which would, by the way, make a deal like this extraordinarily difficult if it happened, if not impossible. So a lot of tough questions to ask, and not just about the assassination attempt in New York. If this had been a deal for non-lethal weaponry, we would have had the same questions. And what we've asked now is that Congress, the 30-day period is passed, but these are ongoing deals. It requires massive amounts of maintenance, personnel, U.S. personnel in India who have to go to India and ensure that the continuing operations are going on. These are long-term contracts. It's like having a service contract, you know, with a service provider. And so there are a lot of tough questions that Congress can ask about this and other deals going forward, and ask how it fits into that. Because I think Congress does need to step up and play a bigger role in asking questions here. You know, did they need these drones, or was it part of a larger geopolitical decision-making process to get India to be less in the world of BRICS and Brazil, Russia, China, and more in our world? Or was it, you know, something India really needed? I can't say. But what I will say is when you have a deal of this magnitude and with a particular weapons platform, which is so culturally and sort of historically linked to targeted assassinations in places like Pakistan and Somalia and other locations, you have to ask yourself about the optics and what message it sends to Modi and his people about what the U.S. is willing to criticize Modi for and not criticize him for, in this case, not criticize him for.
Did any of you wanted to add anything? I do hope that wish is carried out by our members on the armed services and on foreign affairs. I certainly will continue to raise these questions. I carry the resolution to designate India as a country of concern, and I think it is important for us to move with urgency. I thank you all for coming, for your testimony, for the work that you all do, just really grateful that we were able to have this conversation today. And I do hope that it does move more people to do the more just, moral, and right thing. With that, we are adjourned.
Still over 3 months. Yeah, I've known Annie for